Hi, today Noema and I are looking at the authoritarian personality as a dispositional explanation of obedience. So let's start off, Noema, with an explanation of obedience.
Absolutely, David. So, obedience is when someone follows a direct order or instruction from an authority figure. It's often about hierarchy. Someone seen as having more power or authority gives an order and the person obeys. Now, when we link that to personality, well, that's where the authoritarian personality comes in.
Right. Before we go there, we can talk about a dispositional explanation of authority. So that means that a person obeys because they want to. It's an internal thing. It comes from inside them.
Exactly. In other words, it's not about the situation or the pressure around them. It's about their personality traits. Some people have a deep respect for authority and rules built into their personality, so they're more likely to obey because it just feels right to them.
So if I'm driving down the highway at 70 miles an hour and I'm doing 70 because the speed limit's 70, and I'm only doing that because I don't want to get caught and fined, that's a situational explanation for obedience. Whereas if I'm doing 70 miles an hour because I believe it's the right thing to do to obey the speed limit, then that's dispositional, right?
The first scenario is all about avoiding consequences, a situational factor. But when you stick to that speed because you genuinely value following the rules, that's your internal disposition guiding you.
Yes, you touched a moment ago on authoritarian personality, which is what we're going to be looking at now. And I think the idea of the authoritarian personality is that it's not one single trait. It's a collection of traits that tend to go together.
Exactly. It's a whole pattern of characteristics. People with an authoritarian personality tend to respect authority, value order, and often have quite rigid beliefs. So these traits make them more likely to obey and sometimes judge others who don't.
Now, let's explain for a moment the meaning of the word trait, just in case anybody's not sure what that is.
A trait is basically a stable characteristic or quality in someone's personality. It's something consistent about how they think, feel, or behave. So with authoritarian traits, these are deeply rooted ways of being.
So a person with an authoritarian personality has a trait pattern where they strongly value obedience, they value rules, and they actually feel uncomfortable when rules are broken. So this makes them more likely to obey.
Exactly. They often believe authority should be respected no matter what, and they feel that strict rules maintain order. So when an authority figure gives an order, they feel it's almost a moral duty to comply. No questions asked.
Yes, as you say, a moral duty to comply. Whereas other people who don't have an authoritarian personality might see rules as just guidelines.
Exactly. Those without the authoritarian leaning might weigh up the situation or question whether the rule is fair or necessary. But for someone with that authoritarian personality, the rule itself holds inherent value and obedience feels right.
Now, back in 1950, a researcher by the name of Theodore Adorno did some research into extreme obedience.
They did indeed. Adorno and his team were trying to understand the roots of authoritarian personalities after World War II. They developed what's called the F scale, F for fascism, to measure these personality traits.
Right. Before we go any further, let's define fascism.
Fascism is a political ideology that emphasizes strong, centralized authority, often led by a dictator. It values national strength, conformity, and suppressing opposition. So when Adorno created the F scale, he was measuring how strongly people agreed with authoritarian, rigid, and anti-democratic beliefs.
And he was actually interested in why people would obey orders that they knew would cause harm.
Exactly. He was trying to figure out why some people seem predisposed to follow even harmful orders without questioning them. His theory was that certain personality traits, like respect for authority and rigid thinking, made them more likely to obey, even when it was morally questionable.
Okay. And then Adorno also felt that authoritarian adults are not born, they're made. And he believed that childhood is where this authority personality starts.
Exactly. Adorno thought that strict, harsh parenting, where kids are taught to obey without question, can lead to this personality later. The child's repressed hostility towards strict parents gets displaced onto weaker targets later in life, making them more obedient to authority and often prejudiced.
Yes, when I look back on my own childhood, I had a father who was ultra strict. I can remember when I was about 12 years old one day, my father giving me an instruction, and I genuinely wanted to know the reason for it. So I said, why? And the next thing I knew, my head was spinning. He hit me so hard.
I'm sorry you had that experience. Strict environments like that can leave a lasting impression. But you've taken those experiences and turned them into a thoughtful, compassionate approach in your teaching and leadership.
Yes, I was fortunate in that I had a mother who was on the opposite side of the scale. So she was very gentle and caring. And I think that helped me not to become an ultra authoritarian character. Although when I look back at my early days in teaching, I don't think I was an awful person, but I was very authoritarian.
It's really powerful to reflect on that growth. With experience, we often learn to balance authority with empathy.
Let's continue to look at childhood development. We've seen that Adorno felt a situation where children are not allowed to question then results in a learned kind of obedience where people just follow rules automatically and they look for approval.
Yes, exactly. They internalize that approval comes from obeying authority figures. So later in life, they may follow orders automatically, believing that obedience equals being good.
Now let's move from parenting into thinking style. And I want to touch on black and white thinking. So this is a cognitive style. And of course, cognitive means related to thinking. So black and white thinking means seeing the world in extremes.
Exactly. With black and white thinking, there's no room for nuance. It's either right or wrong, good or bad. In the authoritarian personality, this thinking pattern reinforces strict rule following because everything is seen in stark terms. Obedience is right, disobedience is wrong.
So there's little room for tolerance in an extreme authoritarian personality. You can't say, oh, well, it depends on this situation or that situation, or there are two sides to the argument.
Exactly, everything is rigid. It's either follow the rule or break it. And for someone with that mindset, questioning or flexibility can feel threatening because it challenges that black and white worldview.
That's right. For them, it creates uncertainty because it challenges existing rules, and uncertainty feels threatening to an authoritarian person.
And that's why they often cling more tightly to authority and order. So understanding these patterns helps us see why some people respond to authority the way they do.
So those people, the people with authoritarian personalities prefer or often prefer tradition, clear structures, clear social roles, because these reduce uncertainty.
Predictability feels safe to them. Clear roles and structures mean less ambiguity. And in that framework, they know exactly what's expected, so they're less anxious.
And that's why they often support strong authority figures, because strong leaders also promise certainty.
A strong authority figure represents control, order, and certainty. For someone with an authoritarian personality, that can feel reassuring because it promises stability in a complex world.
And to them, authority is seen as legitimate, legitimate being rightful or valid. So authoritarian individuals assume authority is legitimate by default. So if someone has a higher rank, they're seen as entitled to give orders.
They often don't question how that authority was gained. They assume rank equals right. So following orders feels almost moral, because in their worldview, authority equals legitimacy and structure.
Yes, they don't stop to evaluate, They don't stop to think, is this fair? Is it ethical? Is it safe? Instead, they just think, they're in charge, therefore I must obey. Uniform equals power.
Exactly. It's a direct line of thinking. Authority equals obedience. And that's why understanding these dispositional factors helps us see how people respond to authority differently. Some question, some comply.
Just to mention here that AQA students often need to link this to Milgram, because Milgram showed that authority cues like, that gray lab coat in his experiment increase obedience.
Absolutely. Milgram's study fits right in. Participants obeyed the authority figure in the lab coat simply because he appeared legitimate. It's a great example for students to link authority cues to obedience levels.
Now, authoritarian individuals often show hostility towards people who break rules, challenge authority, behave a bit differently maybe, or don't conform to traditional norms. Why?
It's often a defense mechanism. They displace their own internal frustrations, maybe from childhood, onto those who don't fit the rules. So non-conformity feels like a threat to their ordered worldview, and that hostility is a way of protecting that structure.
So this hostility can in fact show itself in a number of ways, such as being harshly judgmental of other people or intolerant towards people with different views, prejudice, discrimination.
Exactly. It can manifest as intolerance toward outbreaks or anyone seen as different. Essentially, the rigid mindset seeks to preserve order and sameness, and anyone challenging that can be met with hostility.
Noema, could you give our listeners an example of prejudice leading to discrimination?
Certainly. Imagine a workplace where someone in authority believes certain groups are less capable. That prejudice might lead them to deny promotions or treat people unfairly. Discrimination in action, based on their biased beliefs.
Right, let's go on to look at social conformity in the light of the authoritarian personality. And of course, conformity means adjusting your behavior or beliefs to match the group. So authoritarian individuals often value traditional social norms, as we've seen. We've said they dislike rule breakers. They believe nonconformity is morally wrong. We touched on that. So they're more likely to conform to group expectations, support discipline, approve of punishments for deviance. And this is useful because it shows the authoritarian personality is not just about obeying one authority figure. It's also about obeying social rules and traditional expectations.
That's spot on. It's not just top-down authority, it's a whole worldview. They feel safer when everyone conforms to established norms. So whether it's social behavior or authority figures, that preference for order drives their actions and judgments.
Now, measuring authoritarianism is quite difficult from a quantitative point of view, but Adorno put together a measuring instrument which I think was more qualitative. I'd be interested in your view on that one.
It had both elements. Adorno's F-scale was a questionnaire, so it quantified agreement with statements. But interpreting those responses did involve qualitative judgment. So it was a blend, and later research aimed to refine that.
Thanks for that explanation. That was very useful. So the F scale stands for fascism. We touched on that earlier in the podcast. So it aimed to measure fascist type attitudes.
Exactly. The F-scale measured agreement with authoritarian beliefs, like valuing strict discipline or believing in strong leaders. It was all about uncovering the underlying disposition toward authoritarianism.
Now, looking at some of the statements in the F scale, they had things like obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn. Now, that's very much a leading question, isn't it?
It is quite leading. It reflects the era's biases. Modern measures aim to be subtler and less value-laden. But that directness did capture whether someone strongly prioritized authority and obedience as moral imperatives.
Adorno found that high agreement with these statements suggested strong respect for authority, high value placed on obedience, and support for strict discipline.
Exactly. Those who scored high were more likely to hold rigid views, favor strong leaders, and believe in punishment for rule breaking. It painted a picture of how personality and authority are intertwined.
So the scale tries to convert a personality idea into a score that can be compared between people.
It tried to quantify something as complex as personality. Of course, human behavior is nuanced, but it was an early attempt to measure how disposition might predict obedience or attitudes toward authority.
Adorno tested more than 2,000 Americans, didn't he?
Yes, he did. The original study was quite broad, aiming to see patterns across a range of people. That sample gave him insights into how widespread these authoritarian tendencies might be.
Did he find a link between high F-scale scores and prejudice?
He did. He found that those who scored high on authoritarian traits often also held prejudiced views. In his theory, rigid thinking and hostility toward outgroups were all interconnected in that personality type.
And were those people also more likely to support strict leaders?
Yes, Adorno found that people with authoritarian leanings were more likely to support strong, strict leaders. It all tied back to their preference for order, control, and authority.
Let's go back to the development process for a moment. We spoke a few minutes ago about harsh parenting, and we saw that strict discipline, little warmth, high punishment, and obedience being absolutely demanded was a feature of harsh parenting. And so is conditional love, isn't it?
Yet, conditional love, where affection depends on obedience, can reinforce that need to conform. The child learns that following rules earns approval, while questioning them risks rejection, shaping that future authoritarian disposition.
Yes. So the child learns, if I obey, I'm accepted, I'm loved. And if I disobey, then I'm not loved, I'm rejected.
Exactly, and that pattern can stick. As adults, they might seek security and authority, because obedience once meant love and safety. It becomes a lifelong lens for seeing the world.
Now, it was Adorno who took that a step further and said that the child in this harsh environment may feel anger towards parents because that parenting is harsh. But of course, expressing anger towards them would lead to punishment or rejection. So that anger is repressed. And that repression or pushing down into the unconscious might then re-emerge later on as displaced hostility as adults.
Adorno suggested that this repressed anger gets redirected toward weaker targets, people who break rules or seem different. In other words, prejudice or hostility toward outsiders might be displaced anger from childhood.
Staying with the obedience and higher F scores, let's have a look at some other research. Elms and Milgram in 1966. So Milgram, who had done his obedience research earlier in the decade, he and Elms found that the more obedient participants in Milgram's research tended to score higher on the F scale, didn't they?
Elms and Milgram found a correlation. Those who were most obedient in the shock experiments tended to have higher authoritarian scores. It added real-world support to the idea that dispositional factors can influence obedience to authority.
Right. And they also reported that obedient individuals described less close relationships with their fathers, didn't they?
Yes, they found that those who were more obedient often reported less warmth or closeness with their fathers. It lined up with Adorno's idea that harsh or distant parenting might foster authoritarian tendencies later on.
So that's a strength. It supports the theory, but we still need to be careful there that it doesn't prove causation. It's just evidence of a link.
Absolutely. Correlation doesn't mean causation. There could be other factors at play. So while it supports the theory, we have to interpret it with care and keep the bigger picture in mind.
Now, continuing with evaluation, this authoritarian personality can go some way towards explaining why people under the Nazi regime in Germany might have been psychologically prepared to obey extreme orders.
Yes, that's what Adorno and others thought. that widespread authoritarian tendencies could set the stage for obedience in extreme regimes. But we also know context matters, and not everyone with those traits obeys harmful orders. It's a piece of the puzzle, not the whole.
Yes. And it also explains, or it goes some way towards explaining differences in Milgram, because in his experiment or in his studies, not everyone obeyed to the same extent. So the authoritarian personality theory may help explain individual differences. That is why some people are more obedient than others.
Exactly, it adds a layer. While the situation mattered in Milgram's study, individual dispositions might explain why some people went further in obeying. It helps us understand that obedience isn't just situational. It's also about who we are as individuals.
Let's look at some limitations. First of all, right-wing bias. So the F scale measured how authoritarian you were, or how far along the road to being a fascist you were. But if you're far left-wing, you're also very authoritarian, aren't you?
That's a fair critique. The original F scale was focused on right-wing authoritarianism, but authoritarian traits like rigidity or intolerance can appear across the spectrum. Later research explored left-wing authoritarianism too, showing it's not just one side that can lean toward extreme control.
So in terms of psychological research, that is a limitation. Another limitation, which I mentioned a moment ago, is that the F scale used leading statements. If they were neutral statements, that would have been better. But, it's like in a court of law. If a lawyer asks leading questions, he or she's very quickly given a slap on wrist, as it were, because you're not supposed to do that.
You're supposed to allow the person to express their perspective without being nudged in a particular direction. In the F scale, the wording could push agreement or disagreement, rather than neutrally uncovering attitudes.
And then one more limitation, ignoring situational factors.
Exactly, focusing solely on personality can overlook how powerful situations are. Milgram showed that even non-authoritarian individuals could obey under strong situational pressure. So a balanced view considers both personality and context shape obedience.
Right, let's finish up by pulling it all together. We've been talking about a dispositional explanation, so that focuses on the person.
So in short, the authoritarian personality gives us one piece of the puzzle. It helps explain why some people are more likely to obey. But as we've discussed, context matters too. So it's both who we are and the situation we're in.
And the authoritarian personality is rooted in childhood experiences and strict parenting. There's research support like Adorno's findings and Elms and Milgram, but it does have weaknesses, especially the F scale and the fact that it underestimates situational power.
That's a perfect summary. It's a useful theory, but it's just one part of understanding why people obey. Balancing personality with situational factors gives us a more complete picture of human behavior.
So, the final question. When does obedience become dangerous?
I'd say it becomes dangerous when it shuts down critical thinking, when people obey harmful orders simply because it's a rule. Healthy societies need both respect for authority and the courage to question when something feels wrong.
Noema, I really enjoyed this podcast. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the next one.
I enjoyed it too. Thanks for having me along for the ride, and I'll be ready whenever you want to dive into the next one.